Okay, so good afternoon and welcome back. I'm delighted to be able to chair this panel on bridging history and innovation in food research. I think this panel fits very neatly with the overarching theme of the retreat of bridging STS and innovation studies. We've got three very exciting talks to come. The panel was organized by my colleague Christine, and it stems from her conviction that there are a number of missed opportunities for discussion and collaboration between people working on the history and people working on innovation-related issues regarding to food and nutrition. So I'm very excited to learn about these opportunities. The format is going to be that each of them is going to talk for 10-15 minutes. There will be very limited time for 1 to 3 specific questions after each talk, and then hopefully we'll have an extended time for discussion. So, Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Cool. Great, so thank you very much, Miguel, for the introduction. Also, thank you very much indeed to Valerie for sorting out the technology. It's much appreciated. For those who don't know me, I'm Christine Knight. I'm a research fellow in science, technology and innovation studies. My main area of research is contemporary food culture with a focus on nutrition and dietary advice. I'm currently funded by the Wellcome Trust to do a project looking at stereotypes of the Scottish diet, especially iconic deep fried foods like the deep fried Mars bar. My training, though, is in literary and cultural studies, so I guess I've thought about interdisciplinarity for a long time. My own research tends to focus on the cultural representation of food and diet, for example, in the media and in popular food and diet writing, which is why I've put up the nice stack of cookbooks there. I'm going to keep my talk quite short and quite personal and informal because I'm aware it's after lunch and we've all been starched up with what we've eaten, so I won't be offended if anyone falls asleep. As some of you know, although I only joined STIS, the subject group, in October last year, I've been affiliated with ISSTI for quite a long time, so since 2008, which is when I first joined the University of Edinburgh. And as Miguel said, I wanted to convene this session for the retreat because in the time that I've been at the university, I've come to feel that there's something of a disconnect within STIS, within ISSTI and within the university between researchers working on different aspects of food. And I called this session Bridging History and Innovation in Food Research. But really, I think the issue is a much broader one, and it's the one that really all the speakers have been talking about today, about interdisciplinarity. And in this case, I think the issue is about connecting researchers from a whole range of disciplines and interdisciplines in the social sciences and humanities, that's kind of the scope for today, doing research about different aspects of the food system, people using different methods and theories, coming from different epistemological and ideological standpoints. The reasons why we might want to do this may be obvious, but I think particularly, I really appreciate Koichi's point about the value of productive conflict and productive challenge. But I think that there is still a value in building these bridges, both internally with a view to maximising collaborative research capacity, funding success and impact, but also externally in terms of food and nutrition, in terms of addressing shared social and political challenges, so including food security and sustainability, nutrition and public health, national and international inequalities in these areas. I think all of these are shared goals. They're quite obvious, but I think they're worth stating. Notwithstanding that kind of framing, a large part of the impetus for this panel for me is personal, as you've probably gathered, which is to say that I guess for me, I'm coming here with some fairly profound existential questions about who I am and where I belong. I don't personally have formal training in STS. I know next to nothing about innovation studies, and I've really appreciated the presentations, especially from Jane and Robin just before the lunch break, which have given me more insight than I've had before about what innovation studies is. Where I would locate myself as a researcher these days is within food studies, and that's a field that I'm going to talk a little bit more about a bit later in the presentation. I should also add, though, that although I first began doing food research 10 years ago when I started my PhD, I've had a 5-year break from food research, and I've only returned to it in October when I joined STIS and started this project. And both these factors mean that in the last few months I've been working really hard to forge connections with food researchers across the university, but I've also been doing a lot of this. So a lot of staring at my navel and trying to think about who I am, where I fit. ISSTI is the right home for me. It is my home for now. What does that mean? How do I make best use of it, both for myself and for others in the next 3 years, which is the term of my fellowship? And that leads ultimately to the questions that I want to ask and that hopefully this panel can go some way towards answering today, which is about, well, where does food research currently sit? And how can we forge the most productive connections between researchers across different disciplines working on food issues? I think the answers to these questions in relation to ISSTI and STIS are likely to come out through the panel and through the presentations from Anne and Isabel, which will follow mine. So I don't want to kind of sort of over-egg or kind of overly focus on those local aspects of the question right now. What I want to do instead is to spend a few minutes talking about the location of food research in the social sciences and humanities, kind of in global academia, and also within the University of Edinburgh, and by talking about professional associations and networks. So in a sense, these are my equivalents of EAST and 4S, which are things that I've only learnt about coming into the subject group and coming into ISSTI in the last few years. And to consider whether the kinds of professional networks that exist at the moment in food studies and in food research more broadly are fit for purpose in terms of forging interdisciplinary connections. So personally, I guess, over the last 10 years, I've come to situate myself at the intersection of these three fields, and they're interrelated and overlapping. So food studies, which is probably the largest, sociology of food, and food history and culture. I'm aware that there's maybe some overlap in terms of how Isabel and Anne would identify, although I'm not sure to what extent, and I'm interested in hearing about that. I want to describe each of these in turn because I think that thinking about how we define our boundaries in terms of professional associations is one way to think about identities and borders. So food studies is the largest international kind of grouping, interdisciplinary grouping of which I'm aware and with which I identify in the social sciences and humanities. It's been described as an emerging field for so long now that I think we now ditch the term emerging. I think it's now established, so that's a good 20, 30 years of history. The major professional association is the Association for the Study of Food and Society. And the ASFS also publishes a key journal, Food, Culture and Society. And I'm aware, I guess one of the main points I want to make is I'm aware that there's relatively little dialogue between these associations and in these journals between this field and STS. And I think also with innovation studies, although I'm less aware. The sociology of food does what it says on the tin. So simply the sub-branch of sociology dealing with food. Within Britain, the British Sociological Association Food Study Group is the major UK professional association. It has a Scottish branch called SCOF, which unfortunately is fairly moribund at the moment, which is a shame. This community is much more obviously disciplined within sociology, though it has interdisciplinary connections with anthropology, for instance, and to a lesser extent with the humanities. And the final one of those three, food history and culture, is longer established and has a very strong European base. So this is the website for the European Institute for Food History and Culture, roughly translated. This is very much more humanities based. And this field of work is much more gastronomic. So it's concerned with food culture with a capital C, as opposed to a small c, where I myself would tend to work. Another key event in this area is the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery. And what's noticeable there is that these events and organisations bring in a lot more non-academic food writers and food scholars. So a whole tranche of people doing independent scholarship, but still making major contributions to food historiography and also reflecting on food history and food studies as disciplines, interdisciplines, areas of work. And as I said, all three of these communities overlap. But there are areas within each which are distinct. And as I indicated, I think unless someone can correct me, which it would be lovely if they could, my strong impression is that these communities are not connecting with STS or with innovation studies. And so the question I really want to raise is about bridging gaps between all of these areas and all of these fields. And this comes back to the point I want to make that I think there are missed opportunities to discuss. Finally, I just want to mention a network at the University of Edinburgh, which I know some of you are aware of and probably aware to the point of being sick of hearing about it, but this is the Food Researchers in Edinburgh Network, or FRIED. This is our launch event last month. All three of us on the panel are members of this network. So this is a new network which has members across all three University of Edinburgh colleges. We also have some members from other Scottish universities. And interestingly, the majority of active members are from within social and political science, although we have other members from the business school, from geosciences, from psychology, from theology even. And part of the reason I want to mention Fried is that I think that the network has the potential to be a broad church for interdisciplinary food research at the university, including all the different kinds of food research that happen within ISSTI. And I'm interested to consider how we maintain that openness in ways that perhaps the national and international networks that I've talked about don't necessarily do. Perhaps that's not their objective. The final point I want to make is a very perhaps the most informal one, because this one probably doesn't make much sense from the slide. It's a point about interdisciplinary working, and it's really a reflection on my experience as an interdisciplinary researcher, but also as an academic migrant. And linking back to the retreat theme of bridging STS and innovation studies. And it's also something that's come up in the coffee breaks and the lunch breaks, which is that I think, in my experience, interdisciplinary working is most challenging when you are working with disciplines that are actually superficially close to your own. You know, they're superficially cognate. So the most challenging collaborations I have had as someone coming from literary and cultural studies have actually been with psychologists, for instance. So when I speak to a scientist or a medic about my research in food, we automatically know that there are methodological differences, that there are epistemological differences. And as a result, we make a huge effort to translate what we're talking about, to understand one another, and also to accept our differences as researchers. But I think where I've run into difficulties is with when you think that someone is coming from the same perspective as you, but it turns out that actually there are words you're using, but you use them differently. There are concepts you're using, but you use them differently. And these are, I think there's a very strong parallel between, for instance, different versions of English, where one thinks that one understands what someone else is talking about, but doesn't, in fact. So for me, that's a useful comparison to my experience as an interdisciplinary researcher. And to take that parallel a little bit further, I was thinking, I guess, about the kinds of strategies I've used or the experiences I've had in moving to the UK and also in interdisciplinary working, and thinking that the only tactics that have really worked in bridging these kinds of deceptively treacherous gulfs between communities are a long period of acculturation, years, making friends with the locals, and also the acceptance that you're going to look very stupid from time to time. And so I wanted to raise that, I guess, in an informal way in this setting as some personal reflections on interdisciplinary working to close. So thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Christine. Excellent timekeeping. So maybe we have time for for 3 questions, points of clarifications. You may want.
Well, I have one question about history, because I've been